It's cruel and unusual punishment you inflict on your speakers that in addition to having an attentive audience, you have this magnificent view of the port of Baltimore to look at. It's a good thing it's not facing west, so it isn't the setting sun in addition. I'm especially happy, apart from coming home, to be here because, as I was telling Dr. Bird earlier, some 35 years ago when I was at Hopkins and was elected president of the International Relations Club there, I think there were 8 members, and I had the ballot rigged. My nephew. We tried to stimulate the discussion of international problems at that time, not only in the university, but in Baltimore, in the city at large. And we staged a number of debates at Levering Hall out there and opened it up to the city. In those days, we managed to get 200, 300, 400 people to listen to I think it was the president of Loyola at that time and a Catholic layman debate the pros and cons of dealing with Franco's Spain. Very hot issue in the 40s. And somebody else debated the extent to which the United States should take a position in the Italian election of 1948, and assorted other things. We had a big debate about the draft, which was proposed for universal military service, and so on. So I've had a long-standing interest in this city's concerns with international affairs, and I'm delighted that this council is now in such prosperous and active business here, and I'm honored to be one of your speakers. I want to talk with you this evening about the prospects for American-Soviet relations over the next several years, about as far as I care to look ahead at the moment, and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. I'm not giving a lecture or speaking from a prepared text, and I also have a voice that is slightly on the blink, so bear with me. It's obvious that relations between the United States and the Soviet Union are at the present time bad. That is to say, the tone is bad, and there is little, if any, progress in the various negotiations that go on in Geneva and Vienna and elsewhere. There is seemingly very little contact between our top officials and their top officials at the present time, although there is, in fact, I gather, a bit more than is generally known. And even the very modest bilateral agreements that we made with the Soviets 10 and 12 years ago in the days of the Nixon administration, some of them actually going back into the earlier administrations, those agreements are for the most part suspended because of the Afghanistan sanctions and the Polish sanctions and the general decline in the atmosphere of relations. It's worth observing that this deterioration in relations is not just a phenomenon of the Reagan administration. It traces back into the Ford and Nixon administrations and certainly into the Carter administration. In fact, I think as we look back over the 70s and see what we can learn for the 80s, maybe the 90s, it does have to be pointed out that the time that we refer to as détente 10, 12 years ago was hardly a tranquil time in American-Soviet relations. At best, it was the start or the renewal or the amplification of a process to establish more restrained relationships between our two countries, to establish safer ways to conduct a basically still hostile relationship. It was a rocky start in the early 70s. We romanticize it now from time to time looking back, or at least some people do, others think it was near betrayal. But it was a rocky start. It encompassed such things as the mining of Haiphong in May of 1972, just 11 years ago, and the bombing of Haiphong when Soviet ships were there in the Vietnam War. It encompassed the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, when American forces were put on alert because of the threats from the Soviet Union to intervene in that war. So détente was never smooth and was never clear, unambiguous in its cooperative aspects. In fact, as I look back to this period a dozen years ago, which so many people do look back to with a certain nostalgia when thinking of American-Soviet relations, and remembering Haiphong and the Yom Kippur War and the crisis in the Indian subcontinent and assorted other very stormy passages between the United States and the Soviet Union. As I look back to that, it's quite interesting that despite the bad tone in our relations and the nastiness that goes back and forth and the deadlock in most of our negotiations with them, nothing comparable to the kinds of confrontations that we had then or in the 60s or the 50s, nothing comparable, really has happened over the last 2.5 or 3 years. So far, in this recent period, the administration here and the Soviets have been quite cautious, not so much in their words, but in their actions toward each other and relevant to each other's interests. Syria may prove to be an exception. I don't know. It's worrisome. But Syria apart, the relationship has been on a remarkably even keel, considering what we say about each other and to each other. And it's worth keeping that in mind as we look forward to the 80s. Let me back up for a moment and reflect briefly on what happened in the 70s, because I think and partly we're still in it, even though we're in the 80s. But I think it's important to have it in mind as we look forward. From the American standpoint, when the Nixon administration, where I happen to be associated at a decision level in the White House, when they came into office in 1969, there were a number of reasons why it was considered desirable to seek an improvement in relations with the Soviets. We never used the word détente at that time. That was something that others attached to it. It was a nice, neat phrase that fit into headlines in newspapers. But the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a thought that perhaps the Soviets might not be uninterested in seeing that war might end if they could get something in return for it from the U.S. It was worth a try. There were, at that time as there are today, major and massive Soviet military programs underway, stemming from decisions that had been made in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. The United States was caught up in the anti-war movement in great divisions in the country. President Nixon, Kissinger, his other advisors, thought it might be desirable to talk to the Soviets more intensively about possibilities of arms control, if only to get some time and room for maneuver to try and reestablish some degree of consensus here at home during this very difficult and anguishing time of the Vietnam War. The only way 10, 12 years ago, and that's very reminiscent of what's happening in the Congress this very day, the only way that you could expect to do anything about our defense posture, which even then had some problems vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, to get the necessary votes, to get the necessary public support for it, was to demonstrate to the people of the country here that you were also seriously seeking to talk to the Soviets about restraints on arms. The two went hand in hand in political terms, and they do today. There was a broader philosophical view about international politics and the stage of development that we had reached in the world at large, and that is also relevant today. And that was simply that the world was obviously becoming a more complex place than it had been in the immediate post-war period. That from what had been largely a bipolar world, there was evolving an international arena with several centers of power, not necessarily the military power that the United States and the Soviet Union commanded, but other forms of power, economic power, simply the power of geographic location. The Japanese were clearly becoming a major factor in international relationships again. The Europeans looked as though through the common market and otherwise they were going to coalesce and become more coherent. In any case, they had certainly come out of their post-war shock. The Arab world was stirring. Some years later, they used oil for the first time as a major military weapon, and so on. The theory that underlay much of what was done at that time was that it would be desirable, and indeed it couldn't be avoided, so we might as well try to shape it. It would be desirable to have the Soviets participate in managing this complex multipolar world, participate in trying to keep change and adjustments and adaptations within some degree of order. And that consequently led to the sequence of dialogues and summit meetings that occurred in the Nixon and Ford administrations. There was also a view which I believe was correct, and it's sort of the mirror image of what I'll say in a minute about the Soviets, that the Soviets were in considerable economic trouble. It's gotten much worse in the meantime. But that they were clearly interested in economic relationships, trading relationships, capital, technology, with the West, with the industrialized countries. And so it was thought a dozen years ago, that being the case, there might be some leverage for the United States in conducting gradually more intensive economic relationships. Some leverage, not so much in pure, simple bargaining terms, but leverage in making clear to the Soviets that if they wanted to tap into the economic resources of the Western world, that it would be sensible for them to exercise restraint in the way they pursued their ambitions in the world. And the hope in the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, was that the government, the executive branch, could get sufficient legislative authority to have some control over the way trade and economic relationships were conducted with the Soviet Union. There were other things that figured at that time in American thoughts, again, some echoes today. The Middle East was obviously a volatile region. During the late 60s, one war had occurred in 67, another was building. There was the period of the attrition in 1970, constant conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. In regard to the Soviets, who were very much involved through the Egyptians and the Syrians, to some extent the Libyans and the Iraqis, the calculation in the administration at that time was that if the United States could demonstrate to moderate Arabs that progress could be made in retrieving their land and in a certain normalization of relations through an American intermediary role, that might lead the Soviets to be more cautious in their more radical approaches. And as a matter of fact, it turned out that many moderate Arabs came to realize, as they do today, that it was not Soviet military support, and it was not Soviet radical political and diplomatic demands, but American diplomacy and American persistence that produced at least certain results in terms of getting territories returned or some adjustments made. So what was undertaken then was a very complex policy with many pieces in it, in the midst of a very divisive war. It required a strong and confident hand at the helm to keep the pieces together and to keep the bureaucratic constituencies, interest groups around Washington and elsewhere, at least not working at cross purposes to each other. It's too much to hope that they'll ever cooperate, but at least one can attempt to prevent them from going to war with each other. So it required a strong and vigorous hand. It required a rough consensus, which was not in existence at that time on some very fundamental issues because of the Vietnam War, but for many other reasons, including the divisive past and personality of the president of that period. It required a degree of harmony and coordination with our allies. But having recited some of these preconditions for conducting a complex and modulated policy, you will readily see that some of these preconditions were not in evidence, or at least were not fully in evidence. Vietnam proved to be extremely divisive, proved to last longer than anticipated, and to become more divisive as we went along. Watergate then robbed the presidency of its authority for a crucial period as far as our relationships with the Soviet Union were concerned, but in many other respects as well. And the American public at large showed considerable discomfort about policies that were as complex and sometimes as ambiguous and sometimes as secretive as the ones conducted at that time. The problem of staying together with our European allies also soon became a serious one, because beneath the crust of alliance solidarity, there have always been divergences in interests and perspective and attitudes, as is natural given the vast geographic scope of the alliance, NATO alliance, given the different histories of the different members, given the fact that all our societies are themselves pluralistic and highly diverse. It isn't surprising that an alliance among such states should itself be diverse and pluralistic. So the Europeans in the 70s developed, especially the Germans, developed a kind of dependence on their relationship improving, on progress in their relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, that turned out to be quite different in character to the American attitude on these matters. American perceptions of relations with the Soviet Union and American needs vis-a-vis the Soviet Union were different in quality and character from those of people that were living and do live close up to the Soviets, and a divided country like Germany, and countries with long traditions of relations with Russia, economic relations, cultural relations, even allied with them, and not just in wartime, but allied in peacetime as well. And so one of the lessons from the 70s, and we still live with these now every day, and at Williamsburg we'll see part of it again this weekend. Some inherent differences in perspective emerged in the 70s as on both sides of the Atlantic. A more active policy of seeking improved relations with the Soviet Union was conducted. And on the Soviet side, the interest in improved relations with the United States was quite palpable, although ambiguous in its nature. Already mentioned the economic problems. They were compounding by the late 60s, early 70s. Growth rates were coming down and so on. Soviets announced officially at one of their party congresses early in the 70s that they wanted to engage in major, massive economic projects with the Western capitalist world. They recognized, maybe more than we did ourselves, they didn't have any huge debates about it, that in order to get the kind of billions and billions and billions of dollars of Western investment in all sorts of industries and projects in Siberia, there had to be at least a modicum of political civility in the relationship. And they indicated as much. I used to say back in 71 and 72 when New York Times and even the Baltimore Sun occasionally taxed the Nixon administration for conducting a policy of linkage, as it was called, relating economic policy to political relations, that we had far less trouble with the Soviets on this score than we did with some of our newspapers, certainly with some of our businessmen. The Soviets under Brezhnev were keenly interested in protecting their gains in the international arena generally, and in achieving recognition as a superpower. It meant a lot to them, meant a lot to him. We tend to underestimate and misunderstand some of the insecurities and the sense of inferiority that the Soviets, particularly the Soviet communists, despite their bluster and their pretensions to a universal system, the insecurities and the sense of inferiority that they carry into their international relationships. Soviets also obviously noticed that the United States and China had begun to talk to each other. And the United States, the Nixon administration, did that very consciously and very deliberately, not just for Soviet reasons, but certainly with the Soviets in mind. And consequently, by the early 70s, the Soviets acquired a stake in not seeing American relations with China become better than American relations with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had just been through one of the recurrent crises, which in the meantime have become permanent, in Poland. They had just been through a major crisis in Czechoslovakia. They apparently came to the conclusion that with all their problems in Eastern Europe, on the whole it would be easier for them to maintain order there in circumstances of relatively relaxed relations with the West. So that was another reason why they were interested. I've already mentioned or alluded to Brezhnev's own personal desire for making moves in the arena of international relations, of being accepted and recognized himself personally as the leader of a superpower, shouldn't be underestimated. He acquired a great psychological and political stake in his relations with the American president, with the United States. Something similar had happened with Khrushchev earlier. With all of this, of course, the Soviets never gave up their aspirations to expand their power. On the contrary, they wanted acceptance of their entitlement to a place in the sun and to a worldwide role. And where the U.S. faltered in the defense of its own interests under the impact of the difficulties, domestic difficulties that I have alluded to, where that happened, the Soviets were prepared to move in and aggrandize themselves. That happened to some extent in the Middle East. It happened later in Southern Africa. Happened in Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Not free of costs for the Soviets. But they saw no particular incompatibility between what came to be known as détente and their very vigorous pursuit of their interests and their ambitions, where they thought the risks were manageable. When the U.S. became so preoccupied domestically that chances were that nothing much would happen if they did this, that, or the other. They proceeded. And of course, their military programs, despite the agreements that were made, didn't slacken. There's an internal rhythm to Soviet military programs that is the product of their own society and their own political system. It's been said lately that the Soviet Union does not have a military-industrial complex. It isn't a military-industrial complex. The economy and the society is geared to the accumulation of military power, 12, 13, 14% of their GNP year after year. It's a lot, and this went on, and to some extent it was part of Brezhnev's political bargain with an important segment of the Soviet elite. The result of these interacting motivations and factors was that many in the U.S. became frustrated by détente, partly because their expectations had been far higher than they should have been. And consequently, the relations with the Soviet Union, the policies of the Republican administrations at that time, rather than helping to build a new consensus in the country, resulted in the countries becoming more divided, and in this instance about Soviet policy as well as other matters. President Reagan, or candidate Reagan, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, did have a substantial majority in the country for the vigorous defense buildup to which he was so obviously committed, and for what he and many people thought was a more robust posture toward the Soviets than had been pursued in the 70s. But it was obviously not unanimity. The country would remain divided. The Nixon policies, to some extent, fell victim because of their complexity and because of the dual character of incentives on the one hand and the maintenance of risks on the other. The Nixon policies fell victim to a crossfire between liberals and conservatives in this country. For the liberals, the arms policies of the Nixon administration were too vigorous. For the liberals, the seeming willingness of the Nixon administration to ignore issues of human rights in the Soviet Union were too callous. And for the conservatives, the policies associated with the word détente, summit meetings, agreements, expectations about improved relations. For them, those policies were too soft, too risky, and too dangerous. It's worth reflecting nowadays that it was a coalition between liberals and rather arch conservatives who in 1973 and 74, when emigration from the Soviet Union was such a big issue, joined together in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which precluded active trading relationships with the Soviet Union. And that this action probably denied that administration and succeeding administrations what could have been a useful instrumentality in the conduct of our relations with the Soviet Union. Now, with all of this complicated and frustrating history, it's hazardous to predict the evolution of American-Soviet relations in the 80s. They could drag along, as they seem to be doing now, on the brink of danger. With lots of debates, but manageable. Little change over what we have now. They could get much worse. We could actually have real, live confrontations, in addition to the bad noise and the deadlocked negotiations. We had that at various times in the past, and we could have that again, whether over Syria, perhaps, or conceivably, although I doubt it, over Central America, or because the Soviets talked themselves into some sort of a frenzy over the deployment of missiles in Europe later this year and feel that they have to do something rash or something demonstrative, whatever. So it could get much worse. But we could also see some effort on both sides, Moscow and Washington, to broaden and deepen some of the contacts that do in fact go on constantly between the two sides. The Soviets may have an interest in this because they have a new leader, not totally new, he's obviously been around for a long time, but a man that'll be 69 shortly. That may not seem very old compared to other leaders, but it's an age where even if he were in the best of health, which he doesn't seem to be, he could not expect to look forward to the 30 years that Stalin had, or the 10 years that Khrushchev had, or the 18 years that Brezhnev had. So he may be interested in having a little breathing spell so that he can consolidate his position, make personnel changes, perhaps open up the system to some fresh blood, or at least to some people that have been waiting in the wings for years and years and years as incumbents get older and older and older. When you have a top leadership that gets older and older and older, the next level gets older and older and older, and there's very little movement. There are a lot of people waiting. So he may be interested in making some changes gradually, and in tackling some of the chronic inertia, waste, mismanagement in the Soviet economy and in many other aspects of Soviet life. I think just today or yesterday there was an article in the Washington Post about the fact that each year the Soviet produces some 800 billion pieces of paper in its governmental institutions. I think we're somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 billion in our government. He has a relatively short time, so he may be interested in at least keeping danger at arm's length, and therefore in talking to us. He also may recognize, as Soviets who come and visit Washington say nowadays, and I've found in conversations I had in Moscow some months ago, they may also figure that Reagan is going to run for re-election and may well be re-elected, and that they have to endure him for another 4 years. They obviously don't like him. They don't like what he says about them. They can't quite make out whether his bark is worse than his bite, but they have been cautious. So they are perhaps beginning to think that they may have to live with him, and therefore it's worth talking to him. But the U.S. has an interest in talking to the Soviets, opening up lines of communication, because there's obvious public uneasiness all over the place about weapons, about the lack of communication. I happen to think that it is perhaps not as prominent as some of the demonstrations and other things would suggest, because there are many other preoccupations in the country that are much closer to home. But I think it is an obvious preoccupation when hundreds of thousands of people get out in the street to demonstrate, and when nuclear freeze resolutions pass the Congress, even though they have no meaning, or the meaning is very complicated to understand and decipher, and right afterwards an MX gets approved. But it reflects the country's uneasiness. So any president, whoever he is, has got to take account of that, and can't simply shut down the relationship with the Soviet Union and let it drift. And the same is true with our major allies, only more so. There people actually get elected to parliaments who are totally at odds with the broad policies of the last 10 or 12 years, and they demonstrate much more aggressively in the streets about missiles and various other things. So for the sake of alliance cohesion, an American president would also have an interest to talk to the Soviets. And then, as I selected some of the factors that played at the time of the Nixon administration, many of those are still in play. Now, if that is correct in terms of the broad motivations of the people in Moscow and the people in Washington, we need to do some things rather than simply aimlessly drift into talks and negotiations and maybe even a summit meeting. The president has referred to that a couple of times with the Soviets. We need to do some rather specific things. First of all, we need to go further along the road of the Skokov Commission and some other things that have been happening in Washington, which I consider very salutary, in putting together military policies, defense policies that we can sustain so that we don't every year tear ourselves apart over every program, over whether it's going to be 5% or 6% or 7% or 4%. I think we've got a rough basis for doing this. It's interesting to me that no serious contender for the presidency that's shown up so far, there may still be some others, in 1984, supports a defense budget increase of less than 4% per year. That would have been a miracle 12 years ago. People wanted to cut down, not to approve increases. So there is a certain basis on which to build. And I think these votes that we're seeing on the MX and some other military matters are a sign that this may happen. It couldn't be done without Democrats. And it is being done with some Democrats who are not noted as wild and zealous enthusiasts for military spending. That, I think, is extremely important if we're going to talk sensibly with the Soviets. They should have no illusion that we can sustain a reasonable defense effort. Second, we do need to proceed in broad agreement with our allies, including on the question of economic relations with the Soviet Union. We have some major differences with allies who are more dependent on this trade than we are. But it ought to be possible to get some understanding, and hopefully Williamsburg will make a little progress in this, that at the very least the Western nations have no interest in making it easier for the Soviets to maintain their own economic priorities that enable them to pump 12, 13% of their GNP into the military each year. I don't think we can stop them or prevent them, but at least what we do economically oughtn't to make it easier for them. And I think that's the sort of thing that we ought to have an understanding, if we possibly can, with our allies, so that again, when we talk to the Soviets and they talk to the Soviets realize that there is some solidity on these kinds of issues in the alliance. Third, we need to push for some ground rules that are applicable to crisis situations such as the one in the Middle East, and less so in Southeast Asia and in Southern Africa and in Central America, or wherever the next crisis may occur in this unstable world in which we still live. That was tried 10 years ago. We should have no illusions. The fact that the Soviets signed documents in this area does not mean that they interpret them the way we do. Anything that is negotiated with the Soviets is bound to be a compromise and therefore subject to interpretation. The Soviets will join in rules of the road only if they recognize that not joining is costlier than joining. So we have to keep up our own guard in these situations to make it interesting to the Soviets to want to participate in restraint. So I think that is an important thing that we need to do. We need by definition, to cultivate a certain degree of contact with Soviet leaders. That's sometimes painful for us because we have a highly moralistic view about many things in the world. And a Soviet leader who's been head of the secret police and who might conceivably have been involved directly or indirectly in the assassination plot against the Pope and many other things is not a very palatable figure with whom to sit at a table, even less playing champagne glasses or kiss or whatever one does at some of these. We in fact have more diplomatic contact with the Soviets than is generally recognized and appreciated. But I think we ought to move toward more contact at higher political levels. I think it's important for these political leaders at least to know each other's faces and to have some sense of who they are. And then to talk. To talk not just about what agreements we might make, but also where we think there are problems and why. That sort of dialogue ought never to break down, and it ought never to be made hostage to the vicissitudes of international tensions. And then perhaps when some of those steps have been taken, it might be a good idea to have a cool, workmanlike summit meeting without a lot of the paraphernalia that usually goes along with that. Curiously enough, perhaps above all, if we're going to enter a period of greater activity, but for its own sake as well, we do need a more orderly government. We need more durable procedures for decision making and for decision implementation. The Reagan administration has not done well in this respect, but criticism can go around to virtually every administration on this score. I think our National Security Council system is antiquated to the extent that it even deserves the name of system. It changes with every president, and we have had so many presidents in the last 20 years that it is constantly changing. I am now inclined to think that the National Security Advisor should be a nominated and confirmed official who should overlap in his term the presidential term, so that he has to stay at least 1 year with a new president, and then if he doesn't like him, he can get another one. He can get his personal advice from other people. He can appoint all sorts of people, but we ought to have a more regularized decision procedure in the White House. That's the only place where we can have it, because the departments of our government will never concede priority of place to another department. The only place they will accept authority from is the White House and the presidency itself. Above all, if we go into a more active phase, possibly in negotiations and talks with the Soviets, we have to realize the limitations of what can be done. The expectations were much too high 10 years ago. At least in the short run, not very much is going to be done beyond talking and some marginal agreements. Even they take an awful long time to negotiate. It is going to be at the margins, but that's better than nothing. The challenge from the Soviets is going to remain for us, even if we talk to them, even if we manage to make some agreements. The world is an unstable place. The world is well, you can cut this out anyway. It says indiscreet. I just said the world is an unstable place. The Soviets are still reaching for global influence. Their military programs have not declined in momentum. It continues to have strong political support in the Soviet system, and it is not likely to be reduced significantly. So while it is tempting, and some of my friends and associates have seen the potential of a new era of accommodation, wide and broad accommodation with the Soviets, we should avoid such dreams. We can get another 38 years without a war. It'll be a major accomplishment in the nuclear age. If we can get 3 more years, 3 at a time, of reduced Soviet expansionism, reduced actual Soviet expansion, it will be a plus. And if we can underpin all of this with some useful agreements, it will be highly desirable. And if we can get and build or rebuild an adequate political consensus among ourselves and with our allies, it'll approach a miracle. But it might help us, and this is not a partisan statement, it might help us to get at least one full two-term presidency in 24 years to do some of these things. Lest all of this sounds too optimistic and hopeful, let me remind you that I began this final section of my remarks by saying that I thought there were three kinds of evolution possible, roughly. One was just to rock along as we're doing. The other was a greater and possibly much more dangerous crisis. Both of these are quite possible, perhaps even quite likely. But there is at least a chance that we can do marginally better along the lines that I have suggested. And I think some of the signs actually point that way. Thank you. I'll take the questions and I'll try and be fair. I'll just take yours. I don't know whether your procedure is to identify yourself, but do what you normally do.
Mr. Sonnenfeld, you did not make too many references to Central America. I take it that you see the exertion of Soviet influence in that area in less apocalyptic terms than the current administration, particularly Mr. Schultz's predecessor, and I take it your colleague, Mr. Haig. Could you comment on that situation?
Well, I don't know about apocalyptic. There is Soviet involvement. I felt that Haig, and I thought it was the president as well, but I may have been mistaken, that Haig was correct in making this an issue early in the administration as a clear signal to the Soviets that if we were going to do some business, this fishing in the troubled waters of Central America, which are troubled for many reasons, including some that go back through history and our own relations with the region, fishing in those troubled waters was going to complicate rather than facilitate relations. So I think he was right in terms of the overall strategy that he was trying to develop to make that an issue. And it remains an issue because that's what the Soviets and the Cubans are doing. That isn't to say that the indigenous sources of tension and friction and instability are not very real. They are. But I think it would help to keep the Soviets at arm's length. And I think the Cubans, Castro, has to recognize that if that is going to be his playground, in addition to Southern Africa and wherever else the Cubans are throwing their weight around, there's going to be a problem. Now, that doesn't solve problems in Central America. I think that requires time, and it's going to be very frustrating. But at least we ought to make clear that this area should be insulated from geopolitical games for advantage. So to that extent, I agree with what the administration is trying to do. Yes.
Mr. Sonnenfeld, you've been called one of the experts that the Reagan administration was listening to in forming and shaping its foreign policy by leading American journals. In your opinion, should the United States enter into a long-term grain sales agreement with the Soviet Union? And what are some of the advantages and dangers of such an agreement?
Actually, the Reagan administration is hard of hearing if they listen to me, but in this case, they turned up the volume because I do think that's what should be done. I may say that I think the grain trade with the Soviet Union is not one of our more brilliant foreign policy exercises. In fact, it's not a foreign policy exercise at all. It's a domestic policy exercise. And it's a domestic economic exercise. But no president is able, and given the kind of agricultural system that we have, international market conditions, no president is able to foreclose access to the Soviet market to American farmers for any length of time. And as long as that is true, then I think it is just as well to do it in an orderly way and to have the Soviets obey certain rules so that they don't do what they did to us in 1972, which was to come in suddenly, very cleverly, perfectly legally, and buy huge amounts of grain when we thought that the Soviets didn't need it, and consequently the prices were very low, and they made a killing. And we got the result here in terms of shortages and rises, increases in our own domestic costs. That I don't think we ought to put up with. I don't blame the Soviets for doing that. If you can buy cheap, you know, why not? So the long-term grain agreement makes sense as long as we're trading, because it sets limits and gives the government some leverage on how to deal with that matter. Yes, sir.
Why has it taken the State Department so long to see the penetration of the Soviets in the Middle East, particularly through the rearming of Syria and through the importation of 15,000 observers into the Baikal Valley?
Well, I can't speak for the State Department, but I don't have the impression that that this is only a recent recognition by the State Department. The Soviet role in Syria, as far as I can tell, has been monitored very closely, at least judging from leaks into the newspapers, which don't come just from the moon. They come out of the government. So it's something that is obviously under close scrutiny. The issue isn't that. The issue really has been the degree to which people are concerned what this might lead to. And of course, one of the concerns is, and legitimately so, is that the Israelis will not stand by indefinitely while the air defense system in Syria is built up with modern Soviet equipment, Soviet personnel, several thousands of them, who could then provide an umbrella of some sort for whatever the Syrians might do in the Baikal Valley or wherever. And historically, the Israelis have not long accepted that sort of thing. Now, we just had an incident today in which some, I guess, unmanned Israeli reconnaissance plane was shot at by some of those anti-aircraft missiles. That could very quickly get out of hand. So that's a real worry. The Syrians could provoke it, the Soviets could provoke it, the Israelis could provoke it, any number of ways in which that could happen. I don't know exactly how to prevent it as long as the situation there is what it is. I think the administration has been trying to exercise a lot of calming influence on the Israelis, and they approved the F-16s and so on. And Arens, I think, since he became defense minister over there, has also tried to keep things at on an even keel. But I don't think any Israeli defense minister or prime minister of whatever party would stand by any more than they did in the case of Egypt when something analogous happened 12 years ago. So that is a very worrisome situation. But I don't think it's something that's been ignored. Yes.
Some of us who don't believe that the USSR has any monopoly on evil, nevertheless are worried by two rather naive questions. The first is, considering that the present regime in the Soviet Union is persecuting the Sakharovs and the Sharanskys and peace dissidents and other dissidents, can we do business with these people as usual? And the second question is, considering their welching on such accords as Helsinki, if we do reach an agreement, can we expect them to live up to it?
Well, we never do business as usual with the Soviets. Business with the Soviets is always unusual, for one reason or another. I mean, even when you deal with them in periods of cordiality, it's not comparable to when you deal with friends. No, you can't ever expect to do business as usual. And I, generally speaking, have no great admiration for these pretty insubstantial agreements like the Helsinki Accord. We managed to put some quite concrete things, we, the allies, the people that negotiated, into that agreement, so at least we have the satisfaction of being able to point out when they're being violated, which sometimes helps. But I think really you can't expect the Soviets to live up to agreements that are vague, at least not to our version or our interpretation of those agreements. They have to be concrete and specific, and the Soviets have to recognize that there is some penalty, some loss, some cost if they don't live up to it. That's the basic condition for making agreements with them. So that's why I was careful, maybe you didn't notice it, in my remarks not to put that much weight on agreements and to be very cautious about the limitations of agreements. I think it's important to talk, and when you can make some agreements, let's make them as specific as we can, and have no illusions that they take a lot of policing, a lot of monitoring. And as things stand now, I would never advocate an agreement with the Soviets in the arms area or in some other area of vital interest to us, where the only recourse we had in protecting our interests was the reliance on Soviet compliance. I think we should always have a reservoir of our own strength and our own options. And indeed, having that maybe may induce the Soviets to abide by agreements. So I treat that with great caution.
In your delineation of how we should approach the Soviets, it struck me, and in your last remarks just now, it struck me that most of the approach is like that of a parent to a child, where the child wants as much as it could get, and the parent has to show the child as an educational process that it's not in the child's best interest, that other things the parent wants, it's in the child's best interest. But there comes a time, as you implied in saying, if we get 38 more years of peace, it'll be a major accomplishment. There comes a time when a stand has to be taken. And to use a poor analogy, sometimes a child has to be slapped. But what situation, hypothetically, could you envision where the United States or the Allied forces have to draw a line and say to the Soviets, don't dare pass it?
Well, I don't know, the parent-child analogy is one that I find terribly appealing. I mean, we learned from the Soviets too, so maybe children, parents learn from children, or children from parents, whatever. I am, generally speaking, not very much in favor of drawing lines. There obviously are some places where we have to do that, but the Soviets and other geopolitically dynamic operators on the international scene have a way of inching up to that line. And you may regret that they come as close as they do. So it's not such a good idea in many instances to draw a very clear line. It's hard to know where to do it, and times change, and you can't change the lines every year. I think that's one of the reasons why I do advocate talking to them, so that you have a means of at least telling them, to the extent that they'll listen to you, that certain things are happening or may happen which are going to touch some very sensitive spots for us. I think we ought to make that clear to the Soviets, not necessarily with boisterous public pronouncements, which may be a challenge to their prestige or whatever, or become a domestic football in the Soviet Union. But we ought to make it clear to them, perhaps in private. And then by our actions. The best way to make clear to the Soviets where our sensitivities are is through actions. And I didn't want to recite a whole long history, but one of the things that we tried to do in the sort of run-up to the summit in 1972 in a couple of places was to make clear to the Soviets that they were coming very close to some very sensitive spots. That was the case in the Jordan crisis of 1970. It was the case when the Soviets tried to see how much they could get away with on the missile issue in Cuba. They tried to put a submarine mothership there, made an issue of that, made an issue of their support of the Indians and the dismemberment of Pakistan, at least as we saw it. There's a lot of dispute about whether that was in fact what the Indians were doing. So we tried to, and of course in Vietnam in various ways as well. So the effort was made then to draw some lines in practice. I don't think the United States is well suited to go around drawing lines. We've got War Powers Acts. The executive branch does not have the capacity to do that on its own. We do have alliances. That is a line of some sort. So I agree with you in principle that we should make clear how we interpret our interests, where our sensitivities are. I'm a little less sure that we should do it with a stick in the sand. I thought I had a cousin over there. Sorry.
I think you would agree that Soviet-American relations took a sharp turn for the worse as a result of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and subsequently their pressures on Poland during that period of crisis. As a result, of course, we refused to participate in the Olympics, and the grain embargo was also a reaction to that. You commented on that, but in your opinion, did we overreact somewhat to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan?
Well, the things that you have mentioned weren't an overreaction, they were an underreaction. I mean, they were in lieu of other things that we might conceivably have done, but that were too risky or we didn't have the means to do it. A lot of these demonstrative things, like not going to the Olympics or slapping on embargoes or canceling a visit with somebody or other, really are symbolic actions. Some of them have some direct impact. I think actually the grain embargo did raise some costs for the Soviets. Also raised some costs for us, but there's no free lunches, and we don't ordinarily make gifts for the Soviets, so that when we withdraw something, we suffer too. But still, those were not overreactions, I don't think, in the real sense. They were highly visible, and in that sense, when they didn't produce any results, or when they produced disunity with allies, they came back to haunt us. The main reaction, of course, was related to both the invasion of Afghanistan and to the collapse of the Shah's regime in Iran, and that was the Carter Doctrine concerning external attacks on the Gulf and the oil routes and so on. That was a very daring act by the American president, because we had nothing whatsoever to enforce that with on the ground. I have no idea what the Soviets were planning to do or might have conceivably done. It was a very daring act. The only thing we really had were nuclear weapons, if there was going to be anything massive from the Soviets, or the start of another theater of war, what later came to be known as horizontal escalation in the Reagan administration. Very risky stuff, and they've backed away from it. Was that an overreaction? It was in the strict sense of the word. A lot of hawks in Washington were very uneasy about a commitment that we had no means to enforce if necessary. I had the same feeling. We've been doing some things since then to give ourselves some military capability through our rapid deployment force and some agreements with some regional powers to do something. We should be in a position to do something. It's an extremely crucial area to us and to others. Whether it was an overreaction in terms of what the Soviets were actually planning to do, I can't really say. I think it is an area of vital interest to us, and perhaps it was helpful that the events in Afghanistan and in Iran woke us up to that fact, and that we're now doing something moderate and over the long term to protect interests in the area. It's also, incidentally, an area in which the Europeans and the Japanese are even more interested than we for economic reasons. We are interested in it for that and for geopolitical reasons, and because the Europeans are so dependent on it. And it's therefore an area where I think we oughtn't to carry the only burden. It's an issue that I think needs to be on the agenda of the alliance continuously. So all in all, The answer to your question, my answer would be no. I don't think we overreacted. I think to some extent we had a gap between the symbolic acts, which made us feel good but didn't have much effect, and the very serious commitment that we entered into without the means to enforce it. And that I wouldn't recommend doing very often because it would get very dangerous. I guess, yeah, okay.
The picture you painted is essentially an equilibrium, even though an unstable level, sure. But if we look past history, these equilibria don't remain forever. I'd like you to step back a little and see if you can paint some fundamental forces that could be acting that will change the situation in whatever time period you care for.
For the worse or better? I said that I thought it could easily get worse, and it's much harder to see it get better. Most of the forces that you're talking about are likely to be destabilizing rather than stabilizing, whether it's economic pressures or pressures in Eastern Europe over there, or pressures between ourselves and our allies that contribute to neutralism in Europe, or the effects of unemployment on public morale in advanced industrial countries, or the tensions between North and South due to economic dislocation and the social impact. All of those things are very much abroad in the world. And most of them are pretty discouraging in terms of equilibrium and stability. I think the one factor which, ironically enough, and we all resisted, is perhaps among the more positive ones, is that in the nuclear age, recourse to war is a much more serious choice than it once was. That factor seems to have worked reasonably well in Europe for the last 38 years. It hasn't liberated the people of Eastern Europe, hasn't ended the division of Europe, so it's a very imperfect peacekeeper. But it is a peacekeeper of sorts, this fear. Unfortunately, it also lends itself to games of chicken, which can be very dangerous. I think on the economic side, there is the possibility of certain interactions and interdependences which may, other things being equal or better than equal, contribute something to stability. In and of themselves, I'm very dubious. It never has in the past. Economic interaction, trade, and so on didn't prevent all sorts of horrors, like the 30-Year War or the First World War or whatever. But it can contribute some. I think time and good sense and maintaining the equilibrium, which is a terrifically difficult and demanding task, are about the best things to look forward to, even if I step back some. Are we up against our time?
Perhaps just one last question.
Well, you pick. You pick.
That's worse than having to end this session. I saw Rabbi Poliakoff first.
Okay, Rabbi.
In a climate where the West in general and the United States in particular can do nothing right, and the communists in general and Russia in particular can do nothing wrong, and where therefore your very sensible and rational presentation would be accepted as almost warmongering, it seems to me that our basic problem is, how do we cope with this kind of a climate, and what can we do to change it so that we can operate in the kind of a climate where people will really know what is right and what is wrong?
Maybe I should let that stand as the benediction.
And maybe I should let that stand as our thanks to our guest for indeed what was a realistic, practical, and sensible presentation. We appreciate your time very much. Thank you. As you leave, let me